Somewhere on the island of Crete, according to a story people were already telling more than 2,500 years ago, a giant made of bronze once walked the coastline 3 times a day, watching for enemy ships. He was not a god. He was not born of any woman. He had been built, joint, by hands that understood something about motion and life the rest of the ancient world did not yet have words for. Nobody who first heard that story thought they were describing anything that might someday actually exist. And yet it does exist now, in laboratories and factories, and the phone in your pocket. Tonight we walk through 12 of the oldest stories human beings ever told each other, some of which turned out to describe things science would not confirm for thousands of years afterward. Let's begin with that bronze giant on the shore of Crete, and the strange, very specific way his makers imagined he could finally be stopped. Talos, the bronze guardian of Crete. In the mythology of ancient Greece, a bronze giant named Talos was said to have been forged by Hephaestus, the god of the forge and craftsmanship, either as a gift to King Minos of Crete or, in some versions of the story, as one of the last surviving members of an entire race of bronze humanity from an earlier age of the world. This second version connects Talos to a broader piece of Greek mythological cosmology described by the poet Hesiod, who wrote of successive ages of humanity, each represented by a different metal, beginning with a golden age of peace and ease, followed by a silver age, and then a bronze age whose people were described as formidable, warlike, and eventually destroyed by their own violence. A strikingly evocative framework in which Talos, if he truly was one of the last survivors of that vanished bronze race, represented something closer to a relic of an entire lost epoch of history rather than a single one-off creation built for a single specific purpose. Whatever his origin, Talos was described as patrolling the island's coastline 3 times each day, a tireless and enormous figure who threw boulders at approaching enemy ships and who, according to some tellings, could heat his own bronze body red hot and then embrace intruders who managed to land, a genuinely brutal method of defense that later Greek writers described without softening it, treating Talos less as a heroic protector and more as a terrifying, almost mechanical force of nature that happened to be loyal to Crete. What makes Talos such a striking figure to revisit today is not simply that he was imagined as a giant, since giants appear throughout world mythology without needing any connection to modern technology at all. What makes him different is the specific way ancient storytellers explained how he worked. Talos was said to have a single vein running from his neck down to his ankle, through which flowed a mysterious life fluid called ichor, the same substance believed to run through the veins of the gods themselves, sealed at his ankle by a single bronze pin or nail. In other words, this bronze giant was described more than 2,000 years before anyone had a word for engineering in the modern sense, as a machine with exactly one point of failure, a single vulnerable connection whose removal would drain the entire system and bring the whole giant to a stop. A concept that any modern engineer designing a machine with a critical seal, a single hydraulic line, or one essential circuit would recognize instantly. The story of how Talos was eventually defeated leans directly into this design detail. According to the wider myth, Jason and his crew aboard the ship Argo had already completed their primary quest, recovering the legendary Golden Fleece from the distant kingdom of Colchis, and were making their long journey home when they attempted to land on Crete to resupply, only to find their approach blocked by Talos hurling boulders at their ship from the shoreline, exactly as he had been built and instructed to do against any approaching vessel he did not recognize as friendly. When the sorceress Medea, sailing with Jason and the Argonauts, needed to get past Crete's guardian, she did not attempt to fight him directly, since fighting a bronze giant with ordinary weapons would have been hopeless. Instead, according to the version of the story preserved by the poet Apollonius of Rhodes, Medea used her knowledge of magic and drugs to either drive Talos into a temporary madness or to trick him into believing she could make him immortal, and in the process caused the pin at his ankle to work loose, letting the ichor drain out of him like oil leaking from a punctured engine, until the giant finally collapsed and died on the rocks of the shore he had guarded for so long. A separate, somewhat less commonly cited version of the myth offers an even more direct illustration of the same underlying design vulnerability, describing an archer named Poeas striking Talos precisely in the ankle with an arrow during the same encounter, piercing the exact vein the giant's entire life depended upon and killing him through a single, well-placed shot rather than through trickery at all, a variant that makes the myth's central engineering lesson that the giant's single point of failure could be exploited by anyone who knew exactly where to aim, even more explicit. It is a striking image once you notice it, an ancient story imagining that the way to defeat an artificial mechanical protector was not brute strength, but understanding its internal design well enough to find the one weak point and exploit it. A strategy that describes an enormous amount of real modern engineering, cybersecurity, and even military history, far more accurately than the Greeks who first told this story could possibly have known. Ancient historians and later classical scholars have long debated exactly what inspired the Talos legend in the first place, and the honest answer is that nobody knows for certain. Some point to the very real, very sophisticated automated devices later built by Greek engineers in Alexandria, temple doors that opened on their own, mechanical birds that appeared to sing, and elaborate water clocks driven by carefully calibrated flows, suggesting that the idea of an artificial being that could move and act on its own was already circulating as a genuine engineering ambition centuries before those particular Alexandrian devices were built, and that Talos may represent an early mythological expression of a technical dream the Greeks would spend the following several centuries actually working toward. It is also worth noting that Talos was far from the only artificial being attributed to Hephaestus within Greek mythology more broadly, since the god of the forge was also credited with crafting a set of golden handmaidens capable of speech and independent movement, said to assist him in his workshop, along with automated bronze tripods that could reportedly move on their own to attend divine feasts without needing to be carried by any servant. Taken together, this entire cluster of stories suggests that ancient Greek imagination had already developed a consistent, recurring interest in the specific concept of artificial, self-moving beings built to serve or protect, appearing not as an isolated one-off invention, but as a pattern the Greeks kept returning to across multiple separate myths, long before any of them possessed the actual engineering knowledge required to build anything remotely comparable in the physical world. Similar bronze guardian legends appear scattered across other ancient Mediterranean traditions as well, including later medieval Byzantine and Arabic accounts describing mechanical lions and singing birds reportedly built for royal courts, works that blur the line between exaggerated legend and genuine surviving descriptions of real, if now lost, mechanical craftsmanship. Others suggest the Talos legend specifically may have grown from far older Minoan bronze working traditions on Crete itself, since the island was renowned in the ancient Mediterranean world for its skilled metalworkers, meaning a story about an impossibly large bronze figure may have started as an exaggerated boast about local craftsmanship before eventually calcifying into full mythology. What nobody debates is how closely the underlying concept anticipated something real. Robotics, in the modern sense, would not exist as an actual field of engineering for well over 2,000 years after this story was first being told around Greek hearths and written down by poets. Modern industrial robotics engineers today build exactly this same principle directly into their machines as standard practice, incorporating a dedicated emergency stop mechanism, often a single, clearly marked physical button or switch, specifically designed to immediately halt an entire complex robotic system the moment something goes wrong. A deliberate single point of controlled failure engineered into the design on purpose, for precisely the same underlying reason Talos' own makers apparently imagined one existing within him, so that an otherwise unstoppable, powerful mechanical system can always be brought to a halt quickly by anyone who understands exactly where to find its one critical vulnerability. And yet buried inside a myth about a mythical island's mythical guardian sits a coherent idea about artificial life. A body that is not alive in the way a human or animal is alive, animated instead by some internal substance flowing through a defined system, vulnerable at one specific, identifiable point, capable of being understood, and therefore capable of being controlled or destroyed by anyone patient enough to study how it actually worked. That is not simply a story about a big, scary statue. That is, whether the people telling it around a fire on Crete understood it this way or not, an early description of what an engineered, artificial protector might actually require to function, and what it would take to stop one. From a bronze guardian with a single fatal weakness, we move now to an entirely different tradition, one born not from Greek myth, but from Jewish folklore, describing a very different kind of artificial being, one brought to life not through metalwork and magic fluid, but through the power of language itself. The Golem and the power of a single word. Jewish tradition contains a genuinely old and remarkably persistent legend concerning a creature called a golem, an artificial being shaped from raw clay or mud and brought to life not through any physical mechanism at all, but through sacred language, specifically through the recitation of certain Hebrew letters and names, or through the inscription of a particular word directly onto the creature's body or forehead. References to the concept of animating clay through sacred speech appear as far back as the Talmud, the great compiled body of Jewish religious and legal commentary completed sometime around the 5th or 6th century CE, where a passage describes a rabbi creating a man through mystical means, though this earliest reference is brief, more a passing example of spiritual power than a fully developed story with a clear narrative arc. Before the far more famous Prague legend took shape, an earlier and less widely known version of the story circulated concerning a 16th century rabbi named Elijah of Chelm, a city in what is now Poland, credited by some earlier written sources with creating his own golem decades before Rabbi Lowe's own life in Prague, suggesting that the core narrative structure surrounding clay figures, animated by sacred language, was already well established within Central European Jewish communities before it eventually became permanently attached to the specific, more elaborately developed Prague version most people recognize today. The specific mystical framework behind these stories draws heavily on a foundational text of Jewish mysticism called the Sefer Yetzirah, or Book of Formation, a work of uncertain but authentically ancient origin that describes the Hebrew alphabet and the sacred names of God as the actual literal building blocks used in the creation of the universe itself, meaning that a sufficiently learned and spiritually disciplined practitioner who understood these letters deeply enough could, according to this mystical tradition, theoretically harness that same creative power on a much smaller scale, shaping raw matter into a living form through properly structured sacred language rather than through any physical tool. Medieval and early modern Jewish mystics who wrote about golem creation treated the practice less as casual magic and more as an advanced, spiritually perilous discipline, one requiring genuine purity of intention and deep textual mastery, since improperly performed rituals were widely believed to risk catastrophic and unpredictable consequences for the practitioner attempting them. The golem legend most people recognize today, however, comes from a considerably later and far more detailed tradition centered on the city of Prague, attributed to a real historical figure named Rabbi Judah Loew ben Bezalel, who lived during the 16th century and served as a genuinely significant religious scholar within Prague's Jewish community. According to the legend that grew up around him, Rabbi Loew shaped a golem out of clay taken from the banks of the Vltava River and brought the figure to life by placing a piece of parchment inscribed with a sacred word inside its mouth, or in some versions by inscribing the Hebrew word for truth directly onto its forehead, a word that, in Hebrew, could be transformed into the word for death simply by erasing its very first letter, meaning the golem's creator held not just the power to animate his creation, but a built-in, deliberately designed method of deactivating it whenever necessary, a safety mechanism woven directly into the language that gave the creature life in the first place. The purpose behind this particular golem, according to the legend, was protective rather than purely academic curiosity. Prague's Jewish community during this period faced genuine, ongoing danger from anti-Semitic violence, including the specific and historically real threat of blood libel accusations, a horrific and entirely false slander in which Jewish communities were falsely accused of committing violence against children for religious purposes, an accusation that had already led to real, devastating violence against Jewish communities across Europe for centuries. According to the legend, Rabbi Lowe created his golem specifically to protect his community from exactly this kind of danger, a silent, powerful guardian summoned into being, not by any conqueror's ambition, but by a community's genuine, desperate need for protection against injustice it had no other reliable way of stopping. Rabbi Lowe himself lived and worked during the reign of the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II, a genuinely real historical ruler whose court in Prague became famous during this period for its deep interest in alchemy, astronomy, and various forms of esoteric and mystical scholarship, an intellectual atmosphere that later storytellers found a genuinely convenient backdrop for stories involving mystical creation, since a Prague already associated in popular imagination with genuine scholarly interest in hidden arcane knowledge provided fertile ground for a legend about a rabbi capable of bringing clay to life through sacred learning. Some versions of the golem legend even describe the creature assisting the rabbi with more mundane tasks around the synagogue and community between moments of genuine crisis, a household servant as much as an emergency guardian, only becoming genuinely dangerous once his specific protective task ran on longer than intended or was left improperly supervised. According to the most popular ending of the legend, Rabbi Lowe eventually deactivated his golem once its protective purpose was no longer needed, removing the sacred word that gave it life and storing its now lifeless clay remains in the attic of Prague's Old New Synagogue, a real, still-standing medieval building that continues functioning as an active synagogue today, with local tradition holding that the golem's remains rest there still, sealed away and forbidden to any visitor, a piece of living folklore attached to an actual physically visitable location that tourists and pilgrims continue seeking out centuries after the legend first took its recognizable shape. What makes the golem story so genuinely striking when considered alongside modern technology is not simply that it describes an artificial servant, since artificial servants and constructed helpers appear across many world mythologies. What makes it different is the specific anxiety woven into later versions of the story regarding what happens when that servant stops being properly controlled. In several later tellings, the golem, though created for protection, eventually grows too large, too powerful, or too literal in interpreting its instructions, continuing to perform whatever task it has been set to, even after that task should reasonably have ended, sometimes causing damage or fear within the very community it was built to protect, until its creator is forced to deactivate it by removing the letter that grants it life, undoing his own creation because it had, in some fundamental sense, outgrown the specific, narrow purpose he had originally intended for it. This particular narrative shape, a created being that performs its assigned function with a kind of relentless, unreflective literalism until its creator is forced to shut it down before real harm occurs, describes something that modern engineers and computer scientists working on artificial intelligence today refer to using an entirely different vocabulary, but recognize immediately all the same. The mathematician and philosopher Norbert Wiener, one of the founding figures of the modern field of cybernetics, explicitly invoked the Golem legend in his 1964 book titled God and Golem, Inc., writing about the genuine risks of building automated systems that could carry out instructions with a literalism their human creators had never fully anticipated, arguing that a machine given a goal without sufficiently careful constraints could pursue that goal in ways its designers never intended and might not be able to easily stop. This exact concern, that a sufficiently capable artificial system might pursue its assigned objective with a rigid, literal-minded thoroughness that produces outcomes its creators never wanted and did not anticipate, sits at the very center of what modern artificial intelligence researchers today call the alignment problem, the still largely unsolved technical and philosophical challenge of ensuring that an increasingly capable automated system's actual behavior remains reliably aligned with its designer's true underlying intentions rather than merely the literal wording of whatever instructions it happened to be given. The connection between the Golem tradition and modern artificial creation runs deeper still, reaching all the way into the very word we now use for a mechanical worker. The Czech playwright Karel Čapek, writing in Prague during the early 20th century, coined the word robot for his 1920 play about artificial factory laborers who eventually rise up against their human creators, drawing directly on the same Czech and Central European cultural landscape that had produced the Prague Golem legend centuries earlier, a landscape steeped in exactly this kind of story about created servants whose obedience cannot be fully guaranteed forever. It is a genuinely remarkable thing to sit with that this specific narrative anxiety, a created intelligence that does exactly what it was told rather than what was actually meant, was already fully formed in Jewish folk tradition centuries before anyone had built a single working computer, let alone one capable of anything resembling independent decision-making. From a servant animated by sacred language, we turn now to a story about a gift so transformative and so dangerous that the God who gave it to humanity was punished for it in a way that has haunted storytellers for well over 2,000 years. Prometheus and the fire that cannot be given back. Among the oldest and most consequential myths to survive from ancient Greece, the story of the Titan Prometheus describes a being who defied the will of Zeus, the king of the gods, specifically by stealing fire from Mount Olympus and carrying it down to humanity, gifting a species that had until that point lived in a state the ancient Greeks imagined as cold, vulnerable, and fundamentally limited, with the single technology that would allow them to cook food, forge metal, warm their homes through winter, and eventually build the entire foundation of organized civilization. Fire, in this telling, was never simply a convenience. It was described as the specific dividing line separating human beings from every other creature on Earth, the one transformative technology that made every subsequent human achievement, agriculture, metallurgy, writing, architecture, possible in the first place. The poet Hesiod, writing considerably earlier than most other surviving sources for this myth, actually credits Prometheus with a broader pattern of favoring and assisting humanity that extended well beyond the theft of fire alone, describing him as having previously tricked Zeus during a dispute over how sacrificial offerings should properly be divided between gods and mortals, arranging the division specifically so that human beings would keep the more useful, edible portions of any sacrificed animal for themselves, leaving the gods with a share that looked more impressive on the surface, but was considerably less substantial underneath, a deception Zeus reportedly saw through immediately, but chose to accept anyway, reserving his genuine anger and punishment specifically for the later, considerably more consequential theft of fire itself. This earlier episode establishes Prometheus well before the fire myth even begins, as a figure whose loyalty had already shifted decisively toward humanity and away from his fellow immortals. A titan actively working against the interests of the ruling gods on behalf of a species that, within this same mythological framework, could not yet even properly feed or protect itself. Zeus's punishment for the theft of fire fell in two separate directions, one aimed at Prometheus himself, and another aimed, with a considerably darker logic, at humanity as a whole for having received the gift. Prometheus was chained to a remote mountainside in the Caucasus Range, a real geographic location at the edge of the known ancient Greek world, where an eagle was sent to descend upon him and feed on his liver each day, an organ the Greeks correctly understood to regenerate, meaning his suffering was designed by Zeus to repeat endlessly, without any natural end, a genuinely brutal punishment that later Greek writers described with real narrative weight, rather than treating lightly. He would eventually be freed, in most versions of the myth, by the hero Heracles, but only after enduring this cycle for what the stories generally describe as a great many years. A separate strand of Greek tradition, recorded by later writers including the poet Ovid, credits Prometheus with an even more foundational act than the theft of fire, describing him as the original shaper of humanity itself, moulding the very first human beings out of river clay mixed with water, breathing life into the resulting figures before ever gifting them with fire. This detail, when set alongside everything else in this list, forms a genuinely striking pattern of its own, since it means one of the oldest surviving Western myths about the origin of humanity already imagined that origin in terms of a clay figure brought to life by a wiser, more knowledgeable being, the same essential structure found independently within the Golem tradition. We walked through earlier in this list two entirely separate mythological traditions, born on opposite sides of the ancient world with no direct contact between them, arriving at strikingly similar imagery to describe the basic act of bringing an inert, shaped substance to life. Humanity's own punishment for having accepted fire arrived through an entirely different figure. Pandora, the first woman according to this particular strand of Greek mythology, crafted at Zeus's own direct command out of earth and water by Hephaestus, the same divine craftsman responsible for forging Talos on Crete, with each of the Olympian gods contributing some specific gift or quality to her creation: beauty from Aphrodite, skill in weaving from Athena, and according to Hesiod's own account, a deceptive, cunning character deliberately instilled in her by Hermes, messenger of the gods, meaning Pandora was constructed, quite deliberately, as an exquisitely appealing but ultimately dangerous gift, sent to Earth specifically to punish humanity for the benefit Prometheus had given them. Pandora was sent to Earth carrying a sealed container, often mistranslated in later retellings as a box, but originally described as a large ceramic jar containing every hardship, sickness, and sorrow that would afterward plague human existence. Pandora's curiosity eventually led her to open the container despite having been warned not to, releasing every contained evil out into the world, with only one thing remaining trapped inside once the jar was finally closed again, a spirit the Greeks called Elpis, generally translated as hope, though scholars have long debated whether its remaining behind was meant as a comfort or as its own subtle additional curse, a false hope that keeps human beings striving even within a world now permanently burdened with suffering. Taken together, these two connected myths describe something that reads, when set beside the last century of actual human technological history, almost uncomfortably precisely. Humanity gains access to an extraordinarily powerful new technology, one capable of genuinely transformative benefit, and that same technology arrives bundled together with entirely new categories of danger and suffering that did not exist before it, dangers that, once released, cannot simply be put back inside their original container, no matter how badly anyone might wish to undo the choice that unleashed them. It is genuinely difficult, once you notice this pattern, not to think of the atomic age specifically, since the physicists who helped develop nuclear weapons during the 20th century repeatedly reached for exactly this same mythological language to describe what they had done. Robert Oppenheimer, the physicist who led the wartime American effort to build the first atomic bomb, is remembered for reaching for a different piece of ancient literature, a line from the Hindu Bhagavad Gita, to describe his reaction to the first successful test of the weapon, but his colleagues and later commentators, writing about the broader history of nuclear weapons development, returned again and again to Prometheus, specifically as the more fitting mythological parallel, since the Bhagavad Gita passage describes personal, individual awe and dread, while the Prometheus myth describes something closer to the collective, civilizational bargain nuclear technology actually represented, framing nuclear technology as a modern Promethean fire, a genuine gift capable of generating enormous amounts of clean energy and, in the very same breath, capable of ending civilization outright, a technology that, once developed, could never again be uninvented or handed back regardless of how many people might come to regret its existence. This same naming impulse has continued well beyond the original nuclear weapons program itself, with a NASA initiative during the early 21st century, focused specifically on developing nuclear power and propulsion systems for deep space exploration, formerly named Project Prometheus, an entirely deliberate acknowledgement from modern aerospace engineers that they were pursuing exactly the same kind of transformative, high-risk, high-reward power source the ancient myth had first described. Technology capable of carrying spacecraft to the outer solar system while carrying its own very real technical and safety risks along with it. The author Mary Shelley made this same connection explicit nearly 2 centuries ago, subtitling her novel about a scientist who creates an artificial living being not as a story about mad science in the abstract, but specifically as the modern Prometheus, deliberately drawing a direct line between the ancient Titan's theft of transformative fire and a modern scientist's pursuit of a transformative and ultimately uncontrollable new form of created life. The comparison has continued to resurface consistently across each subsequent wave of powerful new technology, nuclear power, genetic engineering, and now increasingly sophisticated artificial intelligence, precisely because the underlying shape of the Prometheus story describes something that appears to recur reliably throughout the actual documented history of human innovation. Extraordinary capability and extraordinary risk tend to arrive together as a single indivisible package, and no civilization has yet found a reliable way to accept one half of that package while permanently declining the other. Are these stories predictions, or something older than that? Having walked through Talos, the Golem, and Prometheus together, it is worth pausing to ask a genuinely honest question about what we actually mean when we describe a myth as having predicted the future. None of the storytellers who first shaped these 3 particular tales could have possessed any specific literal foreknowledge of robotics, artificial intelligence, or nuclear weapons in the way a modern science fiction writer might deliberately imagine a plausible future technology. What each of these stories actually captures instead is something arguably more interesting than a simple, isolated prediction. A recurring, deeply human pattern of thought that keeps reasserting itself every single time a society gains access to a new form of power it does not yet fully understand. That pattern follows a remarkably consistent shape across cultures that had no contact with one another whatsoever. First comes the appeal of creating something that can act on your behalf, whether that is a bronze guardian, a clay servant, or a stolen flame capable of warming a home. Second comes the recognition that whatever has been created or acquired does not remain fully within the control of the person who made or took it, developing its own trajectory, its own risks, its own capacity to cause harm the original creator never specifically intended. And third comes the search for some kind of safeguard, a vulnerable ankle, a single erasable letter, a punishment meant to demonstrate the price of overreach, a built-in limit meant to keep the new power contained. The same basic pattern turns up again and again in mythological traditions that share no plausible historical contact with Greece or with the Jewish communities of medieval Europe. Polynesian mythology describes the demigod Maui obtaining fire for humanity by tricking a fire-keeping goddess into revealing her secrets, an act of theft and cleverness that closely echoes Prometheus's own defiance of Zeus, while Chinese creation mythology describes the goddess Nuwa shaping the first human beings out of yellow river clay, growing tired partway through the laborious process and finishing the remaining figures more hastily, a detail some later interpreters have connected to explaining the existence of wealth and social status among human beings, an origin story that shares the same essential clay and craftsman structure found independently in both the Prometheus myth and the Golem legend. This three-part structure appears again and again throughout world mythology, independently invented by cultures separated by oceans and thousands of years, which suggests these stories were never really about predicting a specific future event so much as they were about honestly describing something true about the basic relationship between human ambition and human-made power, a relationship that, it turns out, does not change very much regardless of which century or which specific technology happens to be involved. From a myth about the double-edged nature of transformative power, we turn now to a far more personal, far more intimate story about the oldest human dream of all, the desire to simply leave the ground behind entirely. Icarus and the oldest dream of flight. The story of Daedalus and his son Icarus survives from ancient Greek tradition as one of the most emotionally direct myths to come down to us from the ancient world, a story concerned less with gods punishing mortal ambition from a distance and more with the intimate personal consequences of a father's engineering solving one problem while creating an entirely new one for his own child. Daedalus himself was already established within Greek mythology as a remarkably skilled inventor and craftsman well before the events involving his son, credited with a wide range of ingenious mechanical creations, and his presence on Crete in the first place traced back to an earlier episode of considerable personal disgrace, since Athenian tradition describes him fleeing his home city after killing his own talented nephew and apprentice in a jealous rage, driven to violence upon realizing the young man's natural inventive gifts might one day surpass his own, a detail that gives Daedalus's later relationship with his own son Icarus a genuinely uncomfortable added weight, an inventor whose earlier life had already been marked by a fatal failure to properly guide a younger, less experienced person under his care. That same nephew, remembered in some ancient sources under the name Perdix, was himself credited with a set of genuinely significant early inventions before his death, said to have devised the saw after observing the sharp, jagged spine of a fish, and the compass used for drawing circles after watching 2 points of a hinged tool trace a perfect curve. Inventions the ancient world genuinely relied upon for centuries afterward, meaning Daedalus's fatal jealousy was directed, according to the myth, against a young inventor whose own practical contributions to human technology rivaled or exceeded anything his more famous uncle would go on to achieve. Once exiled to Crete, Daedalus found himself commissioned by King Minos to design and build the labyrinth, an elaborate maze constructed specifically to contain the Minotaur, a monstrous, half-bull creature born from an earlier, deeply unfortunate episode in Minos's own family history that the wider mythology surrounding Crete treats with considerable delicacy. According to the myth, Daedalus had been imprisoned along with his young son Icarus within that very same labyrinth he himself had originally built on the island of Crete, trapped by King Minos, specifically because Daedalus knew the labyrinth's design too well to be safely allowed to leave and potentially share that knowledge elsewhere. An ironic twist in which the inventor's own skill and expertise became the specific justification for his captivity, since a builder who fully understood every twist and turn of a supposedly inescapable maze represented too great a security risk to simply release. Unable to escape by sea, since Minos controlled every ship and every harbour on the island, Daedalus turned to the sky instead. The poet Ovid, in his own later retelling of the myth, describes the construction process in genuinely careful technical detail, with Daedalus arranging real bird feathers in graduated order from smallest to largest, binding the shorter feathers together at their base with linen thread and securing the longer ones with melted wax, gradually building up a curved wing shape modelled directly on the natural design of an actual bird's wing, a description detailed enough that it reads less like casual poetic invention and more like a genuine, if fictional, attempt to describe a plausible piece of engineering, right down to Daedalus reportedly testing the wings himself before allowing his son to wear a matching pair. Before their escape, Daedalus gave Icarus a warning that has echoed through more than 2,000 years of retellings in one form or another, telling him to fly at a careful middle altitude, neither so low that the sea spray would dampen and weigh down the feathers, nor so high that the sun's heat would soften the wax holding the wings together. The instruction was not a moral lesson about ambition in its original framing, so much as a genuinely practical engineering constraint, a specific operational limit built directly into the physical materials of the device his son was about to wear. Icarus, in the flush of his first real experience of flight and apparently caught up in the sheer exhilaration of finally escaping a world that had confined him for so long, gradually climbed higher than his father had instructed, drawn upward by the sky itself, until the heat of the sun did exactly what Daedalus had warned it would do, softening the wax holding his wings together until the feathers began separating and falling away one by one, and Icarus fell from the sky into the sea below, drowning in the waters that would afterward carry his name. Daedalus, looking back and finding his son gone, is described in nearly every surviving version of the story as devastated, an inventor whose creation had worked exactly as designed, right up until the specific operational limit he had explicitly warned about was exceeded. Ancient tradition holds that Daedalus eventually recovered his son's body and buried him on a nearby island, afterward continuing his own flight onward to Sicily, where he is said to have lived out the remainder of his life in the service of a local king, never again attempting the kind of ambitious escape that had cost him his son. The specific stretch of water where Icarus fell became known in ancient geography as the Icarian Sea, and the nearby island of Icaria still carries his name today. A small but permanent piece of the ancient Greek landscape, quietly commemorating a mythological tragedy that unfolded, according to the story, at that exact location. What makes this particular myth so worth revisiting, alongside the story of actual human flight, is not simply that it describes wings, since flying humans and flying creatures appear across an enormous range of ancient mythology worldwide. What makes it genuinely striking is how precisely the myth's central failure describes an actual category of real engineering problem that would not become relevant again in exactly this form until the early 20th century, when human beings finally did achieve sustained flight. Early aviation pioneers faced exactly the kind of narrow operational envelope Daedalus describes to his son, real physical limits on altitude, speed, and material tolerance that, if exceeded even briefly, could and repeatedly did result in catastrophic structural failure and death. The same basic shape of disaster the ancient myth had already described in miniature, a design that works perfectly within its intended limits and fails completely and often fatally the moment those limits are exceeded, whether the material in question is feathers held together by wax or an early wood and canvas aircraft frame, subjected to stresses its designers had not yet learned to properly calculate. The myth's staying power in modern culture reflects this same underlying resonance. The phrase "flying too close to the sun" has become such a deeply embedded piece of everyday language that people invoke it constantly without necessarily remembering or ever having known the specific mythological story it originally came from, using it as a shorthand for exactly the kind of overreach that ignores a known, explicitly stated limit. Early 20th century aviation pioneers were themselves keenly aware of this same mythological resonance, and multiple aircraft, engineering projects, and even entire space programs across the following century have deliberately invoked either Icarus or Daedalus by name. A NASA solar research spacecraft launched during the 21st century, designed specifically to study the Sun by traveling closer to it than any human-made object ever had before, quite deliberately drew on this same ancient mythological framing when engineers and science communicators publicly discussed the mission, since the fundamental engineering challenge involved was, in a very real sense, exactly the challenge Daedalus warned his son about: building a craft capable of approaching the sun's heat as closely as possible without being destroyed by it. An engineering problem the ancient Greeks had already correctly identified in miniature, even if their proposed solution involved feathers and wax rather than a specially engineered heat shield built from carbon composite material. A human-powered aircraft project during the late 20th century, built by a team of engineers specifically to demonstrate that sustained human flight was possible using only the pilot's own muscular power rather than any engine, was itself named Daedalus by its designers. And in 1988, it completed a flight of just over 115 kilometers, launching from the island of Crete and flying for nearly 4 hours before finally coming down in the sea just short of its destination on the nearby island of Santorini, brought down not by any failure of the aircraft itself, but by a sudden gust of wind that snapped its tail boom moments before landing, an almost uncanny real-world echo of the ancient story, an aircraft named for the inventor completing an astonishing feat of engineering only to fall into the sea near Crete at the very last moment. From a myth about the price of exceeding a known physical limit, we travel now to an entirely different kind of ancient story, one that may not have predicted a future technology so much as it accidentally preserved physical evidence of creatures that had been extinct for tens of millions of years before any human being ever walked the earth. Griffins, Cyclopes, and the bones that built a myth. Ancient Greek writers described a creature called the Griffin, part eagle and part lion, said to inhabit remote mountainous regions to the east of the Greek world, fiercely guarding rich deposits of gold from any human being who attempted to approach. A story repeated across multiple ancient sources over several centuries, with a surprising degree of consistency regarding both the creature's general appearance and its specific geographic location. The earliest known written source describing this griffin and gold connection traces back to a now largely lost account attributed to a Greek traveller named Aristeas, said to have journeyed deep into the territory of nomadic Scythian peoples sometime around the 7th century BCE, with later Greek historians, including Herodotus, preserving and repeating second-hand descriptions of what Aristeas had reportedly witnessed and recorded, meaning the Griffin legend appears to have entered Greek literary tradition, specifically through travellers' accounts of genuine, if garbled, information gathered from real nomadic peoples living and prospecting for gold in Central Asia, rather than emerging as a purely internal Greek invention with no connection to any actual geographic reality. For a very long time, modern scholars treated this simply as pure invention, a fantastical creature born from the same imaginative impulse that produced centaurs, sphinxes, and countless other hybrid beings scattered throughout ancient mythology. In more recent decades, however, a considerably more specific and compelling theory has gained serious scholarly attention, developed most thoroughly by the classical folklorist Adrienne Mayer, proposing that the Griffin legend may have originated from something far more concrete than pure imagination. The region's ancient Greek and Roman writers specifically associated with griffins and gold, stretching across parts of Central Asia, including modern-day Mongolia and Western China, happen to overlap remarkably closely with rich fossil beds containing the remains of Protoceratops, a relatively small beaked dinosaur that lived during the Cretaceous period, tens of millions of years before any human being existed to see one alive. A Protoceratops skeleton, weathered and partially exposed by natural desert erosion, exactly as it would have appeared to ancient nomadic peoples travelling through the region, does bear a strikingly close resemblance to the traditional description of a griffin, possessing a beaked skull not unlike a bird of prey, 4 legs, and, in many specimens, the visible remains of a bony frill that could easily have been interpreted by people without any concept of paleontology as the base of folded wings. According to this theory, ancient gold prospectors travelling through these specific fossil-rich regions in search of real gold deposits, which do genuinely exist in parts of this same territory, would have regularly encountered these strange, unmistakably non-mammalian skeletons scattered across the landscape, and, lacking any scientific framework for understanding what a fossil actually was, quite reasonably concluded they were looking at the remains of a dangerous creature that must still be alive somewhere nearby, fiercely guarding the very gold deposits the prospectors themselves were seeking. A closely related ancient legend, also tied to this same general region, and also eventually resolved through patient modern fieldwork rather than fossil evidence, involves the historian Herodotus's own description of gold-digging ants, creatures he described as being larger than foxes, said to burrow into the ground of a remote plateau and throw up gold-flecked sand while excavating their tunnels, gold that local people supposedly gathered by carefully approaching and retreating before the creatures could catch them. This particular story went unexplained for well over 2,000 years until a French explorer working in the high plateau regions of the Western Himalayas during the 1990s identified the actual source of the legend: burrowing marmots, animals whose tunneling habits do genuinely churn up gold-bearing soil in certain specific high-altitude regions, and whose Persian name, when translated imprecisely into Greek many centuries earlier, may have been rendered using a word closer to ant than to marmot, turning an accurate piece of practical mining folklore into a monster story through nothing more than an old translation error. This same general pattern of ancient monster myths potentially originating from misunderstood fossil evidence appears to repeat itself in other well-documented cases across the ancient Mediterranean world. The Cyclopes of Greek mythology, a race of enormous one-eyed giants most famously encountered by Odysseus in Homer's Odyssey, may trace at least part of its origin to the skulls of prehistoric dwarf elephants, an extinct species that once inhabited islands across the Mediterranean, including Crete and Sicily, precisely the regions most closely associated with Cyclops mythology in ancient Greek tradition. A dwarf elephant skull possesses a single large, centrally located nasal cavity, positioned roughly where a single central eye socket would appear to an observer unfamiliar with elephant anatomy. And these skulls, considerably larger than any skull ancient Greeks would otherwise have encountered from a familiar living animal, were regularly being uncovered by ancient quarry workers and farmers across these same Mediterranean islands for centuries. Modern paleontological excavations of cave sites across Sicily in particular have recovered substantial numbers of these dwarf elephant remains, a species now formally known to science as Elephas falconeri, standing only around a metre tall at the shoulder despite belonging to the same broader family as their far larger mainland relatives, their remains accumulating in caves across the island in quantities large enough that ancient inhabitants stumbling across a partial skeleton would have had a genuinely reasonable chance of encountering one at some point during ordinary agricultural or quarrying work. Exactly the kind of repeated, geographically concentrated exposure that would allow a specific misidentification to calcify into a durable regional legend passed down across many generations. Ancient Greek and Roman writers themselves left behind a genuine, documented tradition of treating unusually large, fossilized bones as the physical remains of giants and legendary heroes, rather than dismissing such discoveries or ignoring them entirely. Historical accounts describe enormous bones being put on public display in various Greek and Roman cities, identified by local authorities and priests as belonging to specific mythological figures, including reported giant remains associated with the island of Samos and with several other Mediterranean locations. Discoveries that, based on their described size and the specific regions where they were found, most likely represented the fossilized remains of prehistoric mammoths, mastodons, or other large extinct mammals whose genuine skeletal remains would indeed have appeared to any ancient observer as belonging to a creature of truly enormous scale. The Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder, along with several other ancient writers, documented these giant bone discoveries with what reads today as genuine scholarly interest rather than pure credulity, describing the specific circumstances of discovery and the reactions of local populations in enough consistent, repeated detail that modern paleontologists examining these ancient accounts have been able to reasonably identify, in several documented cases, which specific type of prehistoric animal the described bones most likely actually belong to, based purely on the ancient descriptions of size, shape, and geographic location. A remarkably similar pattern emerged entirely independently on the opposite side of the world, within ancient and imperial Chinese tradition, where large fossilized bones, frequently unearthed by farmers ploughing fields or by workers digging wells, were long identified as the physical remains of dragons, a belief so thoroughly embedded in Chinese culture that these fossils, known as longu or dragon bones, were actively collected and sold for use in traditional medicine for well over 1,000 years, ground into powder and prescribed for a wide variety of ailments. Modern paleontological surveys of regions across China, with a long documented history of dragon bone collection, have confirmed that many of these sites sit directly atop genuinely rich deposits of dinosaur and prehistoric mammal fossils, meaning Chinese herbalists and fossil collectors had, quite unknowingly, been systematically excavating some of the same fossil beds that 20th and 21st century paleontologists would later study using formal scientific methods, arriving at their own culturally specific explanation for the same underlying physical evidence that Central Asian gold prospectors and Mediterranean quarry workers had also encountered and interpreted in their own respective ways. What makes this entire category of ancient monster myth worth calling a prediction, in a meaningful if unconventional sense, is not that ancient peoples somehow anticipated the specific scientific field of paleontology centuries before it existed as a formal discipline, since they clearly did not understand what fossils actually were in the way modern science eventually would. What makes it remarkable instead is that these ancient observers were nonetheless engaging in a careful, evidence-based process, encountering real, physical, unexplained remains, and constructing the most coherent explanation available to them given the observational tools and background knowledge they actually possessed at the time, arriving at conclusions that, while factually wrong regarding the specific nature of the creature involved, were not wrong regarding the underlying reality that something genuinely unusual, distinctly non-human, and authentically ancient truly had once existed and left physical evidence behind. Modern paleontology would not properly recognize fossils as the mineralized remains of extinct prehistoric creatures until the early 19th century, when scientists like Georges Cuvier and Mary Anning began systematically describing and classifying such remains using the comparative anatomical methods that still underpin the field today. Anning herself, working along the cliffs of southern England as a largely self-taught fossil collector, discovered the first correctly identified ichthyosaur skeleton as a child, and went on to uncover the first known plesiosaur specimen, discoveries that, much like the ancient encounters with Griffin and Cyclopes fossils centuries earlier, began with an ordinary person noticing strange bones embedded in rock and asking the same fundamental question ancient gold prospectors and quarry workers had already been asking for thousands of years beforehand, only this time with the benefit of a scientific framework finally capable of answering it correctly. And yet centuries, in some cases likely well over 1,000 years, before Cuvier or Anning were ever born, ordinary people travelling through fossil-rich regions of the ancient world had already correctly identified the core underlying fact that would eventually become the entire foundation of paleontology, that the Earth itself contained the physical remains of enormous strange creatures that no longer existed anywhere on its surface. How researchers tell a genuine echo from a coincidence. Before going any further into this list, it is worth pausing honestly on an important question, since human beings are naturally inclined to notice patterns, and that same inclination can just as easily manufacture a connection that was never really there as it can uncover one that authentically exists. Professional folklorists, historians, and archaeologists who study claims of this kind generally apply a small set of consistent standards before treating any proposed myth-to-reality connection as credible, rather than simply an appealing coincidence assembled after the fact from whatever details happen to fit. The first and most important standard involves specificity. A vague myth about giants existing somewhere in the world offers very little real evidential weight, since giants of one kind or another appear in the folklore of nearly every human culture on Earth, and some such story being loosely consistent with some later discovery somewhere is nearly guaranteed by sheer statistical likelihood alone. A myth that specifies a particular geographic region, a particular physical description, and a particular set of behavioral details, as the Griffin legend does when it repeatedly and consistently ties gold, a beaked skull, and 4 legs to one specific and unusually narrow stretch of Central Asian territory that also happens to be authentically rich in matching fossil beds, carries considerably more evidential weight, precisely because the odds of that particular level of detailed correspondence occurring purely by chance are meaningfully lower. The second standard involves independent corroboration, meaning a proposed connection becomes considerably more credible when multiple separate lines of evidence, written historical accounts, physical archaeological remains, and modern scientific data all converge on the same conclusion independently of one another. Exactly the kind of convergence we will see shortly regarding the Fimbulwinter legend, rather than resting on a single ambiguous piece of textual evidence alone. A well-known case that fails this particular test involves a popular theory proposing that a sudden, catastrophic flooding of the Black Sea basin sometime around 5600 BCE directly inspired the various ancient Near Eastern flood myths, including the biblical account of Noah, a theory that gained enormous popular attention after its initial proposal, but that subsequent more detailed geological surveys of the Black Sea floor have found only partial, contested support for, with several independent research teams reaching conflicting conclusions about the actual speed, scale, and timing of the flooding event in question. A genuinely useful reminder that an appealing, headline-friendly theory does not automatically become established fact, simply because it initially generated considerable public excitement. And the third standard involves intellectual honesty about uncertainty itself, a willingness on the part of researchers to clearly state when a proposed connection remains a compelling hypothesis rather than an established, settled fact, distinguishing carefully between the strongest cases on this list, where multiple independent forms of evidence converge, and the weaker ones, where an interesting resemblance exists, but the underlying historical mechanism connecting myth to reality remains considerably more speculative. From skeletons that inspired monsters, we travel now to a myth about an entire lost civilization, one so compelling that people are still searching for physical proof of it today, more than 2,000 years after a single Greek philosopher first wrote it down. Atlantis and the cities. The sea actually swallowed. The Greek philosopher Plato, writing sometime around 360 BCE in two of his dialogues known as the Timaeus and the Critias, described an advanced, wealthy island civilization called Atlantis, situated somewhere beyond what the ancient Greeks called the Pillars of Heracles, the strait now known as the Strait of Gibraltar, a nation Plato described as having grown so powerful, so militarily ambitious, and ultimately so morally corrupt that the gods eventually caused it to sink entirely beneath the ocean in a single catastrophic night and day, vanishing without a trace and leaving behind nothing but a story passed down, according to Plato's own account, through Egyptian priests who claim to have preserved records of it for thousands of years before Plato's own lifetime. Plato's description of the island itself is remarkably specific and architecturally detailed for a work of philosophy, describing a central hill surrounded by alternating concentric rings of water and land, connected by canals and bridges, with the innermost ring housing a temple dedicated to the sea god Poseidon, decorated according to his account with silver, gold, and a rare reddish metal called orichalcum that shone like fire, surrounded by an outer city laid out with such careful, symmetrical precision that it reads considerably more like an engineer's blueprint than a typical piece of ancient mythological storytelling, a level of architectural specificity that has fueled centuries of speculation regarding whether Plato was describing pure invention or working from some genuine, if garbled, description of an actual place. Scholars have debated for well over 2,000 years whether Plato intended Atlantis as a genuine historical account, a philosophical allegory meant to illustrate the dangers of imperial overreach and moral decay using Athens' own real historical rival, ancient Athens itself having faced its own catastrophic downfall following its defeat in the Peloponnesian War, or some deliberate combination of both approaches, blending real historical anxieties with invented narrative details specifically constructed to make a philosophical point land more effectively with his audience. No archaeological evidence has ever been found that conclusively identifies a real historical Atlantis matching Plato's specific description, and the overwhelming majority of professional historians and archaeologists today treat the story as most likely a philosophical invention rather than a literal historical record, a position significant enough that it deserves to be stated plainly here alongside everything else in this segment. One particular theory regarding a possible real historical inspiration behind Plato's account has attracted sustained scholarly interest over the past century, connecting Atlantis to a real, catastrophic volcanic eruption that struck the Aegean island of Thera, known today as Santorini, sometime during the 2nd millennium BCE, an eruption powerful enough to have physically destroyed a substantial portion of the island itself and to have devastated the sophisticated Minoan civilization that flourished on the nearby island of Crete during this same general period, an actual archaeologically documented civilizational collapse involving a genuinely advanced Bronze Age society being struck by sudden, overwhelming natural catastrophe. Archaeologists excavating the site of Akrotiri, a Minoan-era settlement buried directly beneath the volcanic ash of the Thera eruption itself, have uncovered an entire preserved town, its multi-story buildings, colourful wall paintings, and household furnishings protected from later disturbance by the very same eruption that destroyed it, in a manner genuinely comparable to how volcanic ash later preserved Pompeii, offering modern researchers an unusually vivid, physically preserved snapshot of exactly the kind of prosperous, artistically sophisticated Bronze Age society that some scholars believe eventually fed into Plato's own imagined description of Atlantis. Some researchers have proposed that garbled, centuries-old oral memory of this real Minoan collapse filtered eventually through Egyptian record-keeping and passed down across many intervening generations before finally reaching Plato, may have supplied at least some of the raw material his own philosophical imagination then reshaped into the specific, invented island nation of Atlantis. Though this theory, like every other proposed real-world inspiration for the story, remains a contested and unproven hypothesis rather than an established historical fact. And yet something remarkable happened repeatedly across the 20th and 21st centuries that gives the underlying premise of Plato's story an entirely different kind of weight, even if Atlantis itself specifically remains unproven. Marine archaeologists working across multiple different regions of the ancient Mediterranean and beyond have in fact discovered several genuine, historically real ancient cities submerged beneath the sea. Cities that had once stood as fully functioning centers of ancient civilization before being swallowed by rising water, earthquakes, or coastal erosion, and then subsequently rediscovered by modern divers and archaeologists many centuries later. The ancient Egyptian port city of Heraklion, once a major and genuinely prosperous trading center located near the mouth of the Nile River, sank beneath the Mediterranean sometime around the 8th century CE, likely due to a combination of rising sea levels, soil liquefaction during earthquakes, and the gradual cumulative subsidence of the soft delta ground it had originally been built upon, before being rediscovered largely intact on the seafloor by underwater archaeologists in the year 2000, complete with temples, statues, and the physical remains of its original harbour still recognizable after well over 1,000 years underwater. The discovery team, led by the French underwater archaeologist Franck Goddio, used sonar and specialized magnetometer equipment to locate the buried outlines of the sunken city beneath layers of accumulated silt before carefully excavating the site, eventually recovering an enormous colossal stone statue depicting an Egyptian pharaoh, gold coins, and dozens of ancient shipwrecks still resting in what had once been the city's own working harbour, a snapshot of an entire functioning ancient port frozen in place at the exact moment it slipped beneath the waves. Similarly, the ancient Greek town of Pavlopetri, located off the southern coast of Greece, represents what is generally considered the oldest submerged town yet discovered anywhere in the world, with building foundations, courtyards, and even street layouts still clearly visible on the seabed, dating back to the Bronze Age and gradually submerged over the following millennia through a slow combination of earthquake activity and significant long-term changes in relative sea level along that particular stretch of Mediterranean coastline. Archaeologists mapping the site were able to identify at least 15 distinct buildings, courtyards, and what appear to be religious structures, along with a network of streets laid out in a genuinely organized urban grid, revealing an entire small Bronze Age community whose original inhabitants had no way of knowing that the ground beneath their homes would one day be reclaimed by the sea, only to be walked and mapped again, foot by foot, by divers wearing scuba equipment several thousand years later. And off the coast of western India, near the modern city of Dwarka, underwater archaeological surveys have identified submerged structures that some researchers connect to ancient textual references describing a legendary city associated with the Hindu god Krishna, said in Hindu tradition to have eventually been reclaimed entirely by the sea, though the precise dating and interpretation of these particular underwater structures remains a considerably more contested and actively debated question among archaeologists working in the region than the comparatively well-documented cases of Heraklion and Pavlopetri. None of these real, historically documented, physically verified sunken cities is Atlantis. That distinction is worth stating clearly and repeating, since it would be inaccurate and misleading to suggest otherwise. But taken together, they demonstrate something that Plato's original story got fundamentally right about the physical world, even if every specific detail of his own particular island nation was likely invented for philosophical rather than historical purposes. Coastlines really do shift. Cities really have been built directly on ground that later proved unstable or vulnerable to rising water, and entire once thriving urban centres really have vanished beneath the sea, only to be rediscovered by later generations who had no reason to originally believe such a thing was even physically possible. Plato wrote about a single specific sunken city that appears, as far as the physical evidence currently available to archaeology can tell us, to have never actually existed in the specific form he described. But the underlying phenomenon his story was built around, entire ancient cities being lost beneath the waves and later found again, turned out to be repeatedly, verifiably true, discovered again and again by archaeologists working many centuries after Plato's own death, in locations he almost certainly never knew existed. From a myth about a civilization swallowed by the sea in a single catastrophic night, we travel now to the frozen north and to a story about an entirely different kind of catastrophe, one that a growing number of researchers now believe may describe a real, specific, and thoroughly documented climate disaster that struck nearly the entire world at once. Fimbulwinter, and the year the sun grew dim. Norse mythology describes an event called Fimbulwinter, an Old Norse term generally translated as the Great or Mighty Winter, depicted in surviving Norse sources as a catastrophic period lasting 3 consecutive years with no summer in between, a winter so severe and so unrelenting that it was said to precede and directly trigger Ragnarok, the sweeping mythological destruction and eventual rebirth of the entire Norse cosmos. According to the surviving descriptions preserved in Old Norse poetry, this terrible winter would be marked by unrelenting snow blowing in from every direction at once, bitter, punishing cold, and a complete breakdown of ordinary human society, with brothers turning against brothers and all the normal bonds holding human communities together dissolving entirely under the pressure of prolonged, genuinely desperate hardship and hunger. This winter functions within the broader Norse mythological cycle as the opening act of a considerably larger apocalyptic sequence, one in which the wolf Skoll finally succeeds in devouring the sun, plunging the world into darkness, before the great gods themselves face off against giants and monstrous forces in a final battle that destroys nearly the entire existing cosmic order, only for a new, renewed world to eventually rise up out of the wreckage afterward. Fimbulwinter, in other words, was never simply described as an isolated bad season within Norse tradition, but specifically as the recognizable, anticipated warning sign that the wider mythological household of Norse cosmology understood as the unmistakable beginning of the end, a detail that becomes considerably more interesting once real historical and archaeological evidence for a catastrophic multi-year climate event is factored back into the picture. Volcanologists studying the physical evidence behind the actual 536 CE event have proposed several specific candidate eruptions that could plausibly account for the scale of atmospheric disruption the historical and ice core evidence describes, including a large eruption somewhere in Iceland, a location that would carry particular significance given the Norse connection to this story, alongside separate proposals pointing toward volcanic activity in North America and Central America. Ice core evidence recovered separately points to a second, additional eruption occurring only a few years after the first, compounding the original disruption before the climate had any real chance to recover, which would help explain why written accounts and tree ring records both describe conditions remaining unusually severe for considerably longer than a single eruption alone would typically be expected to produce. For a very long time, Fimbulwinter was understood by scholars purely as mythology, a symbolically resonant but entirely imaginative prelude designed to set the stage dramatically for the coming apocalyptic battle between gods and giants that follows it in the wider Norse mythological cycle. In more recent decades, however, a compelling body of interdisciplinary evidence has emerged connecting this specific mythological winter to an actual, real, and remarkably well-documented climate catastrophe that struck large portions of the entire planet beginning in the year 536 CE, an event modern climate scientists and historians increasingly describe as one of the worst years to be alive in recorded human history, even setting aside the devastating bubonic plague outbreak that would follow closely on its heels within just a few years afterward. That plague outbreak, now generally referred to by historians as the Justinianic Plague, after the Byzantine emperor who ruled during its onset, struck a population already severely weakened by years of failed harvests and food shortages stemming from the climate disruption, and some historians studying the period argue that the compounding effect of consecutive agricultural failure followed almost immediately by a devastating pandemic makes this specific stretch of the 6th century one of the most genuinely catastrophic multi-year periods in the entire span of recorded human history, a real historical 1-2 punch striking a considerable portion of the ancient and early medieval world within the span of less than a single decade. Contemporary written accounts from across the Mediterranean world, including the surviving writings of the Byzantine historian Procopius, describe the sun during this period appearing strangely dim, its light weakened and its warmth noticeably diminished for what these sources describe as an extended period lasting well over a year, with visible daylight reduced enough that people reported being unable to cast a proper shadow even at midday. Procopius specifically wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, resembling the moon, for the greater part of that year, a description strange enough that later historians studying it initially assumed it must be poetic exaggeration, until independent physical evidence from an entirely different scientific discipline eventually confirmed something genuinely severe really had happened to global sunlight during exactly this period. Additional written accounts from Chinese imperial records dating to this same period independently describe a similarly dimmed sun and unusually cold crop-damaging conditions, a genuinely striking piece of corroboration given that Chinese court chroniclers of this era had no plausible means of communication with Byzantine historians writing many thousands of miles away, making it considerably harder to dismiss either account as an isolated exaggeration rather than an authentic, independently observed description of a real global atmospheric event. Tree ring data recovered from sites across Europe, Asia, and North America independently confirms a genuinely severe, widespread, multi-year period of unusually cold temperatures and dramatically stunted tree growth beginning in exactly this same year, while ice cores extracted from glaciers in Greenland and Antarctica reveal a substantial spike in volcanic sulfate deposits dated to precisely this same period, strongly suggesting that one or possibly even two massive volcanic eruptions occurring in rapid succession released enough sulfur dioxide and ash into the upper atmosphere to meaningfully block incoming sunlight across large portions of the entire planet for an extended stretch of time, triggering widespread crop failures, famine, and, according to some historical and archaeological evidence, significant population decline across multiple, entirely unconnected regions of the ancient and early medieval world. Scandinavian archaeological evidence adds a striking further layer of support to the theory connecting this real historical disaster directly to the Fimbulwinter legend. Excavations across Sweden in particular have identified a substantial and remarkably sudden decline in the number of occupied farms and settlements dating to precisely this same general period, along with evidence suggesting that a meaningful percentage of the population in some regions may have died or been forced to abandon their land entirely within a relatively compressed span of years, consistent with a severe, sustained agricultural collapse triggered by several consecutive failed growing seasons in a row. The Swedish archaeologist Bo Graslund, working alongside the historian Neil Price, has published detailed research specifically arguing that this abandonment pattern, combined with the volcanic and tree ring evidence already discussed, provides a coherent, mutually reinforcing case for treating the Fimbulwinter tradition as a genuine folk memory of the real 536 CE catastrophe rather than pure invention. Researchers studying this connection have proposed that the lived trauma of surviving several consecutive years without a proper summer, watching crops fail repeatedly, watching food stores run out, and watching entire communities collapse under the resulting strain, may have been passed down orally across successive generations of Scandinavian storytellers for centuries, gradually taking on mythological and cosmological significance until it was eventually woven into the grand narrative structure of Ragnarok itself, transforming a specific, remembered historical catastrophe into a symbolic, cosmic one describing the end of the entire world, rather than simply one exceptionally brutal stretch of several very bad years. It is worth being honest and appropriately careful about the limits of this particular theory, since connecting any specific mythological tradition to a specific historical event that occurred centuries before that tradition was ever written down necessarily involves a degree of informed, educated speculation rather than absolute historical certainty, and serious researchers working on this question generally present it as a compelling and well-supported hypothesis rather than an established, settled fact beyond any reasonable doubt. But the convergence of evidence here is difficult to dismiss entirely as pure coincidence. Independent written accounts from the Mediterranean describing a dimmed sun, tree ring records from multiple separate continents confirming severe cold, ice core data confirming major volcanic activity at precisely the right moment, and Scandinavian archaeological evidence confirming a real, severe, and sudden agricultural and demographic crisis, all converging on the exact same narrow window of years that Norse mythology would later describe in cosmic and symbolic terms as the terrible winter that finally brought about the end of the world as the gods themselves had once known it. From a myth that appears to encode a real, specific climate disaster, we travel now to the opposite side of the planet entirely, to the oral traditions of Aboriginal Australian communities, and to stories that modern geologists have confirmed describe real coastline changes dating back not centuries, but many thousands of years. The oldest living memory of a changing coastline. Aboriginal Australian communities across numerous entirely separate regions of the continent have maintained oral traditions describing a time when the coastline lay considerably further out to sea than it does today, when land that is now permanently submerged beneath the ocean was once dry ground that people actually walked, hunted, and lived upon before rising water gradually, and in some traditions quite suddenly and dramatically reclaimed that same land forever. For a very long time, these stories were understood by most outside observers, when they were studied seriously at all, primarily as symbolic or spiritual narratives, valuable as cultural heritage, but not necessarily treated as literal historical or geological records describing real, datable physical events. One particularly well-documented example comes from communities along the coast of South Australia, whose traditional stories describe a specific gulf that once existed as dry, forested land rather than open water, a description that matches in strikingly precise geological detail what researchers have independently confirmed the region actually looked like before rising post-glacial seas flooded it thousands of years ago. Similarly detailed traditions from northern Queensland describe specific offshore islands as having once been connected to the mainland by dry land bridges, again matching real, physically documented former coastlines that modern bathymetric mapping of the sea floor can independently confirm existed before being submerged. Nunn and Reid's methodology combined careful linguistic analysis of the specific wording used within each recorded tradition, checking for terms and place descriptions that could be cross-referenced against known geographic features, with marine geological survey data mapping the historical shape of the Australian coastline at various points during the post-glacial sea level rise, allowing the two researchers to test whether a given story's described landscape actually matched a real, datable configuration of the coastline at some specific point in the deep past, rather than simply representing a vague, symbolic reference to change and loss in general terms. Beginning in the early 21st century, a team of researchers led by the geographer Patrick Nunn and the linguist Nicholas Reid undertook a systematic study specifically comparing dozens of these coastal Aboriginal oral traditions collected from communities scattered across widely separated regions of the Australian continent, against modern geological and oceanographic reconstructions of how sea levels around Australia have actually changed since the end of the last ice age. Their findings, published in academic research during the 2000s, were genuinely remarkable. The traditions they examined consistently and specifically described real, geologically documented locations, including islands that are now permanently submerged, bays that did not exist in their current form until sea levels rose to create them, and specific coastal landmarks that modern science can independently confirm were once considerably further inland than they are today, with the general timing implied by these traditions lining up in a genuinely compelling way with the actual documented pace of sea level rise that occurred as the last ice age drew to its close. This particular period of sea level rise took place gradually over a span of several thousand years, beginning roughly 18,000 years ago and largely stabilizing to something close to modern coastal levels somewhere between roughly 7,000 and 6,000 years ago, meaning that if these oral traditions genuinely do preserve authentic cultural memory of these specific coastal changes, as researchers now increasingly believe, they would represent stories that have been maintained, passed down, and kept recognizably consistent across an absolutely staggering number of successive human generations, likely well over 300 generations, transmitted one storyteller to the next, without ever being written down in any form until relatively recent history, an oral transmission timespan that dramatically exceeds what most historians and anthropologists had previously assumed was even possible for any human oral tradition to reliably maintain without the story drifting into something unrecognizable from its original, accurate form. One striking example documented in this same body of research comes from communities in the Gulf of Carpentaria region, whose traditions describe a specific named island that had once been part of the mainland, connected by dry ground that people could walk across before the sea finally cut it off entirely, a detail that matches with real precision what marine geological surveys of that exact stretch of coastline independently confirm about the timing and pattern of local post-glacial flooding. What makes this finding so remarkable and worth including as a myth that in its own quiet way predicted, or perhaps more accurately preserved and eventually confirmed, something modern science would only be able to independently verify many thousands of years later, is the sheer, almost unbelievable durability of accurate factual information passed along purely through spoken storytelling, generation after generation, family after family, with apparently minimal distortion of the core underlying geographical facts across an almost unimaginable span of deep time. Nunn and Reid's research specifically credits certain structural and cultural features of Aboriginal Australian oral tradition itself with helping to explain this extraordinary durability, including strong cultural taboos against altering sacred or historically significant stories, and a deeply embedded cultural practice of cross-checking and correcting stories through structured, communal retelling specifically designed to catch and correct any details that might otherwise drift or change inaccurately over time. A sophisticated, if entirely informal and non-written information preservation system that modern researchers are only now beginning to properly appreciate and understand on its own considerable merits. Rather than a myth that predicted some entirely new future event, this particular case represents something in some ways even more remarkable. A body of ancient storytelling that accurately preserved genuine, verifiable knowledge about the deep past across a length of unbroken time that modern written historical records, by comparison, have not even come remotely close to matching anywhere else in the world. Knowledge that modern geological science would only be capable of independently confirming using satellite data, sediment core sampling, and radiocarbon dating, many thousands of years after the events these stories actually describe had first occurred. What actually keeps a story accurate for thousands of years? Both the Fimbulwinter legend and the Aboriginal coastline traditions we have just walked through raise a genuinely fascinating question in their own right, entirely separate from the specific historical or geological events either one describes. How does any piece of information actually survive in recognizable and reasonably accurate form across dozens or even hundreds of generations of purely spoken transmission, with no writing system involved at any point along the way to lock the details in place? Researchers who study oral tradition as a formal field of scholarship have identified several specific structural features that appear repeatedly across cultures whose oral traditions have proven unusually durable and unusually accurate over long spans of time, features that go a considerable way toward explaining how stories like these manage to survive intact for as long as they demonstrably have. Formal poetic structure, including consistent meter, rhyme, and repeated refrain, functions as a powerful memory aid, since a storyteller reciting a rigidly structured poem will immediately notice and instinctively correct an error that breaks the established pattern in a way that a loosely structured prose story offers no comparable built-in safeguard against. This same principle drove some of the most influential 20th century research into oral tradition, conducted by the scholars Milman Parry and Albert Lord, who travelled to what was then Yugoslavia specifically to study living oral epic singers still actively composing and reciting lengthy narrative poetry entirely from memory, without any written text to consult, in order to better understand exactly how the ancient Greek epics of Homer could plausibly have been composed and transmitted through purely oral means centuries before Greek writing was capable of recording anything nearly that long. Their fieldwork identified specific, repeated formulaic phrases and structural building blocks that singers relied upon to reconstruct lengthy epics on the fly during live performance, a set of techniques that provided real, observable, present-day evidence for exactly the kind of oral transmission mechanism that must have kept older traditions, from Homer's own epics to Fimbulwinter to the Aboriginal coastline stories, recognizably intact across so many centuries of purely spoken retelling. Communal, rather than purely individual, transmission provides a second powerful safeguard, since a story told and retold within a group setting, where multiple listeners already know the correct version and can immediately correct a storyteller who begins drifting from it, proves considerably more resistant to gradual, accumulated distortion than a story passed down through a single unbroken individual chain with no external checking mechanism at all. And a strong culturally embedded sense that a particular story carries real sacred or legal weight, rather than functioning as pure casual entertainment, tends to motivate communities to actively police the story's accuracy far more rigorously than they would ever bother to do for a tale told purely for amusement. It is worth noting honestly that these safeguards, however effective, are not absolute, and oral tradition in general remains considerably more vulnerable to gradual distortion than a written record, particularly once a story is removed from the specific structural, communal, and ceremonial context that originally helped preserve it, similar in principle to the way a simple message can shift unrecognizably as it passes informally from person to person without any of these formal preservation mechanisms in place. This is precisely why researchers apply the same careful standards discussed earlier in this list before accepting any specific oral tradition as an accurate record of real historical or geological fact, treating durability as a genuine possibility rather than an automatic guarantee. Taken together, these mechanisms help explain why certain specific categories of ancient story, sacred cosmological accounts, formally structured epic poetry, and culturally central historical or geographic traditions have repeatedly proven capable of preserving accurate information across spans of time that would otherwise seem almost impossible to credit. From a story that quietly, accurately preserved an ancient physical truth across an almost unimaginable span of generations, we turn now to the opposite end of the scale entirely, to an ancient cosmological tradition from India that imagined timescales so vast they would not be matched by modern scientific estimates of the actual age of our own planet until the 20th century. The Hindu Kalpa and the true age of a world. Ancient Hindu cosmology, developed and refined across a body of religious and philosophical texts stretching back well over 2,000 years, describes time not as a simple linear progression, but as an enormous cyclical structure unfolding across almost incomprehensibly vast spans, built up from smaller units into progressively larger ones in a carefully structured mathematical system. This system begins at a remarkably tiny scale, with certain philosophical and religious texts describing units of time small enough to represent something close to an instant, before building steadily upward through days, years, and a recurring cycle of 4 progressively shorter and morally more degraded ages called yugas, each yuga lasting many hundreds of thousands of years, with one complete cycle through all 4 yugas, together forming a single Mahayuga, a great cycle lasting over 4 million years on its own before the entire pattern begins again from the start. This same basic impulse toward describing vast, cyclical cosmic time appears independently within Jain cosmology as well, a related but theologically distinct ancient Indian tradition that developed its own separate system of enormous time units, including a measurement called a paleopalma and an even larger one called a sagaropalma, used to describe the length of cosmic ages in terms so large that Jain texts themselves resort to elaborate metaphors, describing a unit of time equal to how long it would take to empty an enormous pit filled with fine hairs if a single hair were removed once every 100 years, a deliberately, almost playfully incomprehensible way of communicating that ordinary numbers were no longer adequate to the scale being described. At the heart of this cosmological framework sits a still larger unit of time called a Kalpa, generally understood within Hindu tradition as a single day in the life of the god Brahma, the creator deity within this particular strand of Hindu religious thought, itself made up of a full 1,000 Mahayugas strung together, a single Kalpa lasting, according to traditional calculations preserved in texts, including the Puranas, approximately 4,320,000,000 years, an absolutely staggering span of time for any ancient civilization anywhere in the world to have proposed as a meaningful, genuinely intended unit of cosmological measurement, particularly one arrived at through philosophical and religious reasoning rather than any instrument capable of directly measuring geological time. Hindu cosmology does not even stop at a single Kalpa, going on to describe Brahma's own total lifespan as lasting 100 of these enormous cosmic years, each made up of 360 Kalpa days and equally long Kalpa nights, extending the total imagined scale of cosmic time into the hundreds of trillions of years, a span so vast it comfortably exceeds even the current scientific estimate for the age of the entire observable universe many times over. For comparison, modern geological and astronomical science using radiometric dating techniques developed only within the past century, currently estimates the age of the Earth itself at approximately 4,540,000,000 years, meaning the ancient Hindu concept of a single Kalpa lands within roughly 5% of the actual scientifically measured age of our own planet, an astonishingly close approximation for a figure derived entirely through ancient religious and philosophical reasoning, working with absolutely no access to any of the modern scientific tools, instruments, or physical evidence that would eventually allow 20th century scientists to actually calculate this same figure with real, verifiable precision. That modern figure itself rests on a genuinely elegant piece of nuclear physics, measuring the steady, entirely predictable rate at which certain radioactive elements trapped within ancient rock and meteorite samples decay into other elements over time. A natural clock ticking away at a fixed, scientifically known pace regardless of any external condition, allowing researchers to calculate backward from the current ratio of parent to decayed material and determine with real confidence exactly how long ago a given sample first solidified, a technique that did not exist in any form until the early 20th century, and that depends entirely on an understanding of atomic structure the ancient world could not possibly have possessed. It is worth being genuinely careful and appropriately honest about exactly what this remarkable numerical proximity does and does not actually demonstrate, since it would be easy and ultimately misleading to present this simply as evidence that ancient Hindu sages somehow possessed secret, advanced scientific knowledge unavailable to the rest of the ancient world. A more measured and considerably more likely explanation lies in the specific mathematical structure Hindu cosmological texts used to build up their overall timescale. Since this system was constructed using a series of nested time cycles, smaller units multiplied upward into progressively larger ones according to specific numerical ratios that held genuine religious and philosophical significance within Hindu thought regarding cosmic cycles of creation and destruction, meaning the eventual, enormous total figure emerged as a natural mathematical consequence of extending an internally consistent numerical system to its logical conclusion, rather than through any direct empirical measurement of the physical world. Of the kind modern science eventually developed the instruments to actually perform. Even accepting this more measured explanation, however, the achievement remains remarkable in its own right and deserves to be treated as such rather than dismissed. Ancient Hindu philosophers were operating within a cosmological framework that comfortably imagined universal timescales stretching across literal billions of years, at a moment in world history when most other ancient civilizations working within considerably more constrained cosmological frameworks generally imagined the entire universe as having been created only a few thousand years earlier, an enormous conceptual difference in scale that placed ancient Hindu cosmology philosophically and imaginatively far closer to modern scientific understanding of deep time than nearly any other ancient religious tradition anywhere in the world was prepared to seriously entertain. For a useful point of comparison, calculations based on genealogies recorded within the Hebrew Bible, most famously popularized many centuries later by the 17th century Archbishop James Ussher, placed the creation of the entire universe at only around 6,000 years before his own lifetime, a figure that remained broadly influential within much of Western religious thought for a considerable stretch of subsequent history. Ancient Greek philosophy took a rather different but equally distinct approach from the Hindu cyclical model, with Aristotle in particular arguing that the universe had always existed and would always continue existing, with no beginning and no end at all, a position that avoided assigning any specific age to the cosmos whatsoever, rather than embracing anything resembling the vast, structured, cyclically repeating timescale found within Hindu cosmological texts. Set directly against these considerably different ancient approaches, the willingness of ancient Hindu cosmology to comfortably describe cosmic cycles stretching across billions upon billions of years, organized into a genuinely coherent, internally consistent mathematical system rather than either a fixed short timeline or an entirely unmeasured eternity, looks less like a lucky numerical coincidence and more like a fundamentally different, and in hindsight considerably more accurate, philosophical starting assumption about the sheer scale of time itself. Whether or not any individual ancient thinker specifically intended the resulting Kalpa figure to correspond precisely to the literal, physical age of the Earth, as later determined by 19th and 20th century geology, the willingness to seriously imagine and mathematically formalize cosmic time on a genuinely vast billions of years scale represents a real and significant conceptual achievement, one that stands in striking, well-documented contrast to how most of the rest of the ancient world was thinking about the age and duration of the universe during this same broad historical period. From a myth about the vast scale of cosmic time, we travel now to ancient Persia, and to a religious tradition whose specific vision of history's ultimate ending would go on to quietly reshape the core beliefs of literally billions of people across three entirely separate world religions. Zoroaster's vision and the ending. Every later religion borrowed. The prophet Zoroaster, also known by the name Zarathustra, founded a religious tradition in ancient Persia at a date scholars still debate, with estimates ranging anywhere from roughly 1500 to 1000 BCE, though some researchers place him considerably later, closer to the 6th century BCE. A genuine, ongoing scholarly disagreement worth acknowledging honestly, rather than presenting a false sense of certainty regarding exact dates that remain the subject of active academic debate. According to Zoroastrian tradition itself, Zoroaster experienced a series of direct visions and revelations from Ahura Mazda, while still a young priest within an earlier, polytheistic Persian religious tradition, revelations that led him to reject the worship of the many older Persian gods in favor of a considerably more focused, ethically demanding theology, centered on a single supreme deity and a genuinely radical emphasis, unusual for its time, on individual human free will and personal moral responsibility, teaching that every single person bore direct personal responsibility for choosing between good and evil through their own thoughts, words, and actions, rather than having their fate determined purely by birth, social position, or the arbitrary favor of a particular deity. Whatever his precise dates, Zoroastrianism developed into the dominant religious tradition of the ancient Persian Empire, and within its theology described a sophisticated vision of cosmic history unfolding as an extended struggle between a supreme force of goodness, order, and truth called Ahura Mazda, and an opposing force of chaos, deception, and destruction called Angra Mainyu, a struggle Zoroastrian tradition describes as ultimately destined to end in the complete and final triumph of good over evil. Zoroastrianism itself, despite its enormous indirect historical influence on other faiths, never grew into anything resembling the massive global religion its theological descendants would eventually become, and following the 7th century Arab conquest of Persia, its practitioners faced sustained pressure and gradual decline within their original homeland, with many followers eventually emigrating to India, where their descendants, known today as the Parsi community, continue practicing the faith in cities including Mumbai, maintaining fire temples and religious traditions passed down in an unbroken line stretching back towards Zoroaster's own original teachings, even as the total global population of practicing Zoroastrians today numbers only in the low tens of thousands, a genuinely striking imbalance between the faith's own modest surviving size and the almost incalculable scale of its indirect theological influence on the billions of people belonging to the three much larger religious traditions it helped shape. This final triumph, described within Zoroastrian tradition using a term generally translated as the final renovation or the making wonderful, was understood to involve a series of specific eschatological events, a final cosmic judgment in which every human soul who had ever lived would be evaluated according to their thoughts, words, and deeds, the dead being physically resurrected and reunited with their bodies, and the entire world ultimately being purified and renewed, restored to a perfected state free from suffering, death, and evil, with even those souls previously judged and punished eventually being purified and welcomed back into this final, restored creation. A striking detail suggesting that Zoroastrian tradition envisioned final judgment as ultimately rehabilitative and restorative in its deepest purpose, rather than describing a punishment intended to last forever without any possible resolution. Zoroastrian tradition also describes this final renovation being brought about through the arrival of a savior figure called the Saoshyant, said to be born of a virgin who conceives after bathing in a lake said to contain Zoroaster's own preserved essence, a messianic figure destined to lead humanity through the final judgment and the resurrection of the dead. This specific combination, a miraculously conceived savior figure arriving to preside over a final resurrection and judgment, bears a structural resemblance to messianic and virgin birth traditions that would later become central to Christian theology, a parallel numerous historians of comparative religion have examined closely as part of the broader, well-documented pattern of Zoroastrian theological influence flowing into the Abrahamic religious traditions that developed in its wake. The consequential part of this story, and the reason it belongs on a list of myths that predicted the future, lies not simply in the internal content of Zoroastrian belief itself, but in the specific, well-documented historical influence that belief system exerted on the later development of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, three entirely separate world religions that today collectively claim well over half of the entire planet's religious population. Following the Persian conquest of Babylon under Cyrus the Great in 539 BCE, the Jewish community that had previously been held in exile within Babylon came into sustained, direct cultural and religious contact with Persian Zoroastrian belief and practice for an extended historical period. Cyrus himself is remembered within the Hebrew Bible in favorable terms, credited with permitting the exiled Jewish community to return home to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, a policy of religious tolerance historians generally connect to broader Persian imperial governing practices of this era, and one confirmed independently by a real surviving artifact, an inscribed clay cylinder recovered by archaeologists in the 19th century, describing Cyrus's own policy of permitting displaced peoples across his empire to return to their homelands and restore their traditional religious practices, physical evidence sitting entirely outside any religious text that corroborates exactly the kind of tolerant governance the Hebrew Bible itself describes. Many historians of religion argue that specific concepts that appear only sparsely, if at all, within earlier Hebrew scripture, including a clearly defined final resurrection of the dead, a decisive cosmic final judgment separating the righteous from the wicked, and an active personified force of cosmic evil opposing a supreme singular God, become considerably more developed and considerably more prominent within later Jewish religious writing, composed after this specific period of sustained contact with Persian Zoroastrian religious tradition. These same theological concepts, once they had become more firmly established within later Jewish religious thought, went on to form an absolutely central part of the theological foundation of Christianity, which emerged directly from within this same broader Jewish religious tradition several centuries later, carrying forward concepts of final resurrection, decisive final judgment, and a cosmic struggle between good and evil forces as central pillars of Christian theology from its very earliest recorded beginnings. The Christian vision of a heaven reserved for the righteous and a fiery place of punishment reserved for the wicked, a final trumpet call summoning the dead from their graves, and an ultimate cosmic confrontation between Christ and a figure of embodied evil, Each carry a structural resemblance to specific, older Zoroastrian eschatological concepts, detailed and consistent enough that historians of religion generally treat the connection as considerably more than mere coincidence. Islam, emerging several centuries after Christianity from within this same broader Abrahamic religious tradition, likewise incorporated a remarkably similar eschatological structure, including its own detailed vision of final judgment, bodily resurrection, and ultimate cosmic reckoning between righteousness and evil. Structural theological parallels detailed and specific enough that historians of comparative religion have studied and written about this particular chain of historical religious influence extensively across more than a century of dedicated academic scholarship. It is worth being careful and precise here, since this is a case where the actual, well-documented historical mechanism is considerably more interesting and considerably more significant than any vague general claim about ancient mystical prophecy might suggest on its own. Zoroaster did not claim, within his own recorded teachings, to be describing some specific, distant future event separate from his own core theology, the way a fortune teller might claim to predict a specific isolated occurrence completely disconnected from everything around it. He was instead describing what he sincerely believed to be the ultimate inevitable destiny of the entire cosmos as he authentically understood it through his own religious vision. And yet that specific vision of history's ultimate ending, a final judgment, a bodily resurrection, and an ultimate decisive triumph of good over evil went on to become, through entirely traceable, well-documented historical channels of cultural and religious contact and exchange, the foundational eschatological framework that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam would each independently adapt and build upon in their own distinct ways, meaning that a religious vision first formally articulated in ancient Persia quietly shaped and continues to shape today the deepest beliefs about death, judgment, and ultimate cosmic meaning held by an enormous share of the entire population of the modern world, whether or not any individual believer today has ever even once heard Zoroaster's own name. When belief in a prophecy changes what actually happens. Zoroaster's story raises a genuinely interesting distinction worth carrying forward into the remaining stories in this list. The difference between a prophecy that shapes reality simply because enough people come to believe it, and a myth that happens to describe something later confirmed by entirely independent physical or historical evidence. Zoroastrianism's eschatology did not need to be objectively, literally true in order to become one of the most historically consequential religious visions ever recorded, since its influence flowed not through any supernatural accuracy, but through ordinary, traceable, cultural transmission. One community of people genuinely believing something and passing that belief along to their neighbors, who passed it along in turn, until it had reshaped the foundational assumptions of several entirely separate world religions. This distinction matters considerably once actual historical events enter the picture, since a widely believed prophecy can genuinely influence how real history unfolds, regardless of whether the prophecy itself contained any accurate information about the future at all. A ruler who believes an omen predicts his defeat may make more cautious, hesitant decisions precisely because of that belief. Decisions that then actually contribute to bringing about the very defeat the omen supposedly predicted, a phenomenon sociologists studying this pattern in entirely modern secular contexts call a self-fulfilling prophecy. Keeping this distinction firmly in mind becomes especially important as we now turn toward two final stories where popular legend has claimed a far more direct, literal kind of prophetic accuracy than the historical evidence actually supports. Cases where the real story turns out to be less about ancient people genuinely predicting the future and more about later storytellers reshaping the past to make it look that way. From a prophecy about history's ultimate ending that quietly reshaped the beliefs of billions of people, We travel now to Mesoamerica and to an ancient calendar system whose supposed prediction of the actual literal end of the entire world caused widespread public anxiety across the modern globe as recently as the year 2012. The Maya long count and the world that did not end. The ancient Maya civilization, which flourished across parts of what is now Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and neighboring Central American countries for well over 2,000 years, developed one of the most sophisticated and mathematically precise calendar systems anywhere in the ancient world, including a specific long-range dating system. Modern scholars call the long count used specifically to track extended spans of time far beyond what shorter, more locally focused Maya calendar cycles were designed to measure. Maya astronomers operated alongside this long count system a considerably shorter, religiously significant 260-day calendar called the Tzolk'in, used for divination and ritual timing, and a separate 365-day solar calendar called the Harb, tracking the agricultural and seasonal year, with these two shorter cycles interlocking together to form a combined cycle lasting 52 years before repeating, a genuinely sophisticated mathematical system that Maya priests and astronomers maintained and cross-checked against real, careful astronomical observation of the Sun, Moon, and the planet Venus in particular, whose movements Maya astronomical tables tracked with an accuracy that genuinely impresses modern researchers studying the surviving records today. The long count calendar organized time into a series of nested cyclical units, and its largest commonly used unit, called a baktun, represented a period of approximately 144,000 days, or just under 400 years, with the ancient Maya calendar's own internal starting point, corresponding to a specific creation date within Maya cosmology, generally calculated by modern researchers to correspond to a date in the year 3114 BCE, according to our own modern calendar system. Much of what modern scholars actually know about the precision of Maya Venus observation comes from a single surviving bark paper document known as the Dresden Codex, one of only a small handful of genuine pre-conquest Maya books to survive the widespread destruction of indigenous texts that followed European colonization, containing detailed tables tracking the movements of Venus across the sky with an average margin of error of only a few hours across a calculation cycle spanning many decades, an extraordinary degree of naked-eye astronomical accuracy achieved without telescopes, without any of the mathematical tools modern astronomy relies upon, and maintained consistently by generations of Maya priests trained specifically in this demanding observational discipline. The reason so few of these original Maya books survive at all traces back to a specific, well-documented historical event, when a Spanish bishop named Diego de Landa, working in the Yucatan region during the 16th century, ordered the mass burning of Maya religious manuscripts as part of a broader campaign against what colonial authorities regarded as idolatrous practice, destroying what were very likely dozens or even hundreds of accumulated centuries of Maya astronomical, religious, and historical writing in a single deliberate act, leaving only a handful of codices that happened to have already been removed from the region before the burning took place. A genuine historical tragedy that means modern researchers studying Maya astronomy and calendar systems today are working from only a small surviving fraction of what once existed. According to this same calculation, the 13th baktun of the current long count cycle, a particular cyclical marker that held genuine ritual and cosmological significance within authentic ancient Maya religious tradition, was due to complete on a date corresponding to December 21st, 2012 on the modern Gregorian calendar. When this specific date first began attracting widespread public attention during the early 21st century, an enormous and truly global wave of popular speculation emerged, much of it heavily amplified through the internet, popular books, and a widely watched Hollywood disaster film, released specifically to capitalize on the growing public interest, all promoting the claim that the ancient Maya had specifically predicted the literal catastrophic end of the entire world to occur on this precise date. Professional Maya scholars and epigraphers, the researchers who actually specialize in reading and interpreting authentic surviving Maya inscriptions, responded to this wave of popular apocalyptic speculation with something approaching collective, well-documented frustration, since the genuine scholarly consensus regarding what this specific date actually represented within authentic ancient Maya belief was and remains considerably more measured and considerably less dramatic than the popular apocalyptic narrative suggested. The completion of a back-tune cycle within authentic Maya cosmological understanding functioned conceptually in a manner closely comparable to how a modern calendar simply rolls over from one century to the next, a significant, genuinely meaningful marker of cyclical renewal and cosmological transition within Maya religious thought, but not according to any surviving authentic Maya inscription that scholars have actually identified and translated. A specific prediction of literal worldwide destruction or apocalyptic catastrophe of the kind popular media was so heavily promoting during this period. In fact, only a small handful of authentic ancient Maya inscriptions referencing this specific 2012 date have ever actually been discovered by archaeologists, and the small number that do exist describe the occasion in relatively celebratory, ceremonial terms associated with the completion of a significant calendrical cycle, rather than describing anything resembling catastrophic destruction or the literal ending of the world. The most frequently cited of these, a partially damaged stone monument recovered from the archaeological site of Tortuguero in the Mexican state of Tabasco, contains a heavily eroded inscription that some early popular interpretations misread as describing a dramatic, destructive event tied to the 2012 date, before more careful subsequent epigraphic work determined the passage most likely referenced the expected return of a specific Maya deity associated with ordinary ritual renewal, a considerably less dramatic reading that better fits the surrounding ceremonial context of the rest of the inscription. A separate, better preserved inscription, recovered from an entirely different archaeological site in Mexico and studied closely by Maya epigraphers, explicitly references events described as occurring after this particular date, a detail that on its own effectively rules out any authentic ancient Maya belief that this date represented some kind of definitive, literal endpoint for either the world or for time itself, continuing to unfold naturally afterward. December 21st, 2012 arrived, and exactly as the overwhelming scholarly consensus among professional Maya researchers had confidently and correctly predicted well in advance, absolutely nothing catastrophic occurred anywhere on the planet as a direct result of the date itself. The scale of public anxiety leading up to that date had been genuinely significant, with reports of increased sales of survival supplies and underground shelters in several countries, and the popularity of the panic grew substantial enough that NASA itself took the unusual step of publishing official statements and video explanations in the months beforehand, specifically reassuring the public that no credible scientific evidence supported any of the various doomsday scenarios then circulating, ranging from claims about a hidden rogue planet on a collision course with Earth to predictions of catastrophic solar storms, none of which had any genuine connection to the Maya calendar itself, having simply been attached to the same popularly circulating date by unrelated internet speculation. What makes this particular case worth including on a list otherwise focused on myths that seem to accurately anticipate real future events or discoveries is precisely the instructive contrast it provides, a clear, well-documented, and relatively recent example of how an authentic and sophisticated ancient system of astronomical and calendrical knowledge can become badly distorted, sensationalized, and fundamentally misrepresented once it passes through several intervening layers of popular culture, entertainment media, and modern anxiety, becoming a claim ancient Maya astronomers themselves never actually made in the first place. A useful reminder that not every popular story describing an ancient prophecy accurately reflects what the civilization in question actually believed or intended their own careful astronomical calculations to represent. From a myth about the world ending that turned out to be a modern misunderstanding, we travel now to Mesoamerica's other great civilization, and to a story about a returning god that some later writers claimed had accurately predicted, well in advance, the arrival of Spanish conquistadors and the sudden catastrophic fall of an entire empire. Quetzalcoatl's return and the fall of an empire. Among the Aztec people of central Mexico, the god Quetzalcoatl, commonly depicted as a feathered serpent and associated within Aztec religious tradition with wind, learning, and the priesthood, held genuine and deep religious significance for many centuries before the arrival of any European explorer anywhere near the shores of the Americas. Quetzalcoatl was also closely associated within Aztec cosmology with the planet Venus, understood as the god's own heart transformed into a star after his departure from the world, rising and setting in a cyclical pattern that Aztec priests, much like their Maya neighbors, tracked with genuine astronomical precision, a celestial rhythm of disappearance and return that mirrors, in the sky itself, the same core narrative of departure and eventual return that defines the god's own mythology on Earth. Quetzalcoatl's mythology and worship predate the Aztec Empire itself by a considerable margin, with earlier Mesoamerican civilizations, including the Toltecs, maintaining their own traditions concerning the deity, and some scholars connect the specific legend of a departed god promising eventual return to an earlier, semi-historical Toltec ruler named Topiltzin, who took the name Quetzalcoatl as a religious title and was, according to Toltec tradition, eventually driven from his own city following a bitter political and religious conflict, afterward traveling east and vanishing, with some versions of his story describing him sailing away on a raft of serpents while promising he would one day return to reclaim his rightful position, a considerably older and more historically grounded possible origin for the return narrative than any story invented purely in response to Cortez's arrival. According to a story that became genuinely widespread following the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire during the early 16th century, the reigning Aztec ruler Moctezuma II and his people believed, in the specific year that Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés happened to actually arrive on the coast of Mexico in 1519, that Cortés himself might represent the literal return of Quetzalcoatl, a god who, according to this same popular narrative, had once departed the land with an explicit promise to someday return, arriving specifically from the direction of the rising sun. A detail popular retellings connect directly to the genuinely fateful timing of Cortés's actual arrival from across the Eastern Ocean. This particular story, describing Moctezuma's supposed paralyzing religious uncertainty and hesitation, specifically because he genuinely believed Cortés might be a returning god, became an enormously popular and frequently repeated narrative detail within European accounts of the conquest written during the decades and centuries that followed these events, offering later readers and writers a dramatic, almost tragically fated explanation for why such a comparatively small Spanish force, numbering only a few hundred men, was ultimately able to overthrow the entire Aztec Empire, a genuinely massive and militarily sophisticated state that commanded an army numbering in the tens of thousands within the remarkably compressed span of only about 2 years. It is worth noting that Aztec religious life did genuinely include real, well-documented anxiety about cosmic endings, though tied to a considerably different source than the specific Quetzalcoatl narrative later popularized by European writers. Aztec cosmology held that the sun itself required regular nourishment through ritual offerings to continue rising each day and every 52 years, marking the completion of a full cycle of their interlocking ritual and solar calendars. Aztec priests conducted an elaborate new fire ceremony specifically intended to ensure the world would not end and the sun would continue its journey across the sky for another full cycle. A genuine, deeply held cultural anxiety about cosmic renewal that existed independently of any specific belief about Cortes personally, and one that some historians suggest may have been more directly relevant to the general religious atmosphere Cortes actually encountered than the specific returning god narrative that later became so widely repeated. Modern historians specializing in Aztec history and culture, however, have subjected this particular popular narrative to serious and increasingly skeptical scholarly scrutiny over the past several decades. The historian Matthew Restall, in particular, published influential research directly challenging the traditional god-returning narrative, arguing that much of the specific framing describing Moctezuma as paralyzed by religious awe originates far more clearly from Spanish and later colonial-era retellings eager to justify and dramatize the conquest than from the actual documented beliefs of the Aztec people living through the events themselves. A considerable and growing body of academic research now suggesting the entire god-returning story may have been substantially invented, or at the very least significantly exaggerated and reshaped by Spanish chroniclers and their indigenous Christian convert collaborators writing several decades after these actual historical events had already occurred, constructing a version of history that conveniently and rather usefully framed the conquest as something close to divinely fated or inevitable, rather than accurately and honestly describing what most likely actually happened. A considerably more grounded combination of real military tactics, real and devastating epidemic disease, and calculated political alliances that Cortes formed with several of the Aztec Empire's own numerous existing regional rivals and enemies within Mesoamerica. Factors considerably more directly responsible for the empire's actual downfall than any specific religious confusion or paralysis on Moctezuma's own part. The most historically significant of these more grounded factors involved the substantial military alliance Cortes successfully formed with the Tlaxcalan people, a powerful and independent indigenous nation that had long resisted Aztec domination and that ultimately provided Cortes with many thousands of indigenous soldiers, considerably outnumbering his own comparatively small Spanish force. A genuine, decisive military alliance built on real, pre-existing Mesoamerican political rivalries that had nothing whatsoever to do with any religious confusion regarding Cortes's supposed divine identity. Equally significant, and arguably even more directly decisive in the empire's actual downfall, a catastrophic smallpox epidemic swept through the Aztec population beginning in 1520, a disease entirely new to the Americas, against which indigenous populations possessed no prior immunity whatsoever, killing an enormous proportion of the population, including, according to most historical accounts, Moctezuma's own immediate successor, in a devastating public health catastrophe that severely weakened the empire's capacity to resist further military pressure at precisely the moment it needed that capacity most. Surviving, contemporary Aztec accounts of Moctezuma's actual documented reaction to Cortes's initial arrival, several of which do survive and have been carefully studied by historians specializing in Aztec primary source material, generally depict a ruler who was reasonably cautious and understandably uncertain regarding these strange, entirely unfamiliar newcomers arriving from across the ocean, but not one who was specifically and definitively convinced, in the particular dramatic way later popular legend would go on to claim, that Cortes represented the literal returning incarnation of a specific god. One of the most valuable of these surviving sources, a massive compiled work known today as the Florentine Codex was assembled decades after the conquest by a Spanish missionary working directly with indigenous Aztec scribes and elders who still remembered the events firsthand, and even this considerably more detailed and carefully gathered account presents a picture of genuine uncertainty and political calculation on Moctezuma's part, rather than any straightforward, fatalistic, religious surrender to a returning god. Some contemporary historians researching this specific question have further suggested that any real religious uncertainty Moctezuma and his advisors did experience regarding the newcomers may have become considerably exaggerated and reshaped only in hindsight, once the empire's actual devastating military and political defeat had already occurred, offering both the conquerors and later generations of chroniclers a psychologically and narratively satisfying explanation for a catastrophic outcome that more mundane, unglamorous historical factors, superior European weaponry in certain tactical contexts, catastrophic and unprecedented epidemic disease, devastating a population with no prior immunity, and opportunistic political alliances with resentful and rebellious existing Aztec tributary states, likely explain considerably more directly and more completely on their own. This particular story earns its place on this list precisely because of what it teaches about the real difficulty of separating authentic ancient prophecy from narratives that were substantially constructed, or at the very least heavily reshaped and dramatized, well after the specific historical events they claim to have predicted had already occurred. Quetzalcoatl was, without any real scholarly dispute whatsoever, an authentically ancient and deeply significant deity within Aztec religious tradition, worshipped for many centuries before Cortés ever set foot anywhere near Mexico. Whether Moctezuma and his people sincerely believed Cortés specifically represented that same god's actual literal return, however, remains a considerably more doubtful and increasingly contested historical claim than popular legend has generally suggested. An important reminder that the most dramatic and narratively satisfying version of any historical story is not always, and in fact is often not, the version that most accurately reflects what the people actually living through those specific historical events truly believed and experienced at the time. Looking back across every single one of these 12 stories tonight, from a bronze giant with a single vulnerable vein, to a clay servant animated by sacred language, to a calendar system badly misread by an anxious modern world, what stands out is not that ancient people somehow possessed literal knowledge of the future in the way a fortune teller might claim to. What stands out instead is how carefully and how consistently human beings across dozens of entirely separate cultures kept returning to the exact same handful of underlying concerns, the risks buried inside powerful new technology, the very real limits of ambition and the danger of ignoring them, the vast and humbling scale of deep time, and the profound difficulty of ever really knowing, with full and total certainty, what tomorrow actually holds. Some of these stories, like the real climate disaster hiding inside Fimbulwinter, or the real coastline changes preserved inside Aboriginal oral tradition, turned out to describe something factually true about the world, confirmed centuries or even millennia later by tools their original storytellers could never have imagined. Others, like the widely repeated legend of Quetzalcoatl's supposed prophecy, or the popular apocalyptic panic wrongly attached to the Maya calendar, remind us that the most dramatic version of a story is not always, and is in fact often not, the version that is actually true. Perhaps the most honest way to close is this. These 12 stories were never really trying to describe our specific world, with its robots and its reactors and its satellites tracking the sea. They were trying to describe something considerably more permanent than any single invention, the recurring shape of what it feels like to be a species capable of building, dreaming, and reaching well past the edge of what it can fully control or understand. Every civilization that ever told one of these stories around a fire, in a temple, or in a quiet room before sleep, was doing exactly what we are doing tonight, trying to make sense of a world too large and too uncertain to ever be fully known, using the only tool available to any of us across every single one of these thousands of years. A story told carefully enough and passed on far enough that some small piece of the truth inside it managed to survive. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.